Good evening. My name is Tom Giroux, and I'm with the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. You can see a little information about our organization up on the screen right now. Our mission is to inform, educate, archive, and publish. Now, I haven't talked much about this in the past, but I wanted to mention that we do maintain an archival materials at the Stevens Point campus in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. So we're very appreciative with their partnership to maintain and archive some of the history of Wisconsin's forests at Stevens Point. Everything you see tonight is free. It's to inform and educate. So if you're interested in supporting our mission, I would encourage you to become a member of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. Simply go to the webpage, and you can see it there, the membership section, and it's a $20 a year for an individual membership, which I think is a great deal, and you will help support the mission of the organization. I'm going to turn it over to my coworker tonight, Don Schnitzler, to talk about the presentation we're going to hear. It's fascinating. I'm really excited. I feel like I'm really a member of the Plunkett family. So since they did a lot of work in the Manitowish Waters area, and my family is also from the area. So I'm really excited by this presentation. Donald.
Okay, as Tom said, my name is Don Schnitzler. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. And I'm pleased to welcome all of you tonight to our February 2025 presentation. To aid in the success of this webinar, there's a couple things we'd like to have you do. First, if you have questions that arise during the presentation, we ask you to type them into the chat feature, and you can do that anytime during the presentation. And then at the end of the webinar presentation, Becky, Tom, or I will relay questions to our speaker. If you're new to Zoom and you have challenges navigating the system, you can use that same chat feature to pose questions, and one of us will also try to reach out to you and solve whatever that problem might be. And finally, at the end of tonight's webinar, there'll be a brief survey that will pop up from Zoom. And we'd greatly appreciate it if you take just a few minutes to fill that in for us so that as we start looking at planning future webinars, we have that information to work off of. This evening's presentation is titled James Plunkett, Forestry and the 10th Engineers of World War I. From a set of postcards from 1917-1918 found in an attic in Manitowish Waters, comes the story of a young lumberjack who was recruited to serve in the 10th Engineers in France during World War I. The presentation follows his experience and helps reveal the significant contributions of American lumberjacks sent to France to supply the vital natural resources of wood products needed to win World War I. Our speaker tonight is Kay Krans. Kay is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Mississippi State University. She spent her career teaching high school history and as an adjunct lecturer teaching social studies in the College of Education at Mississippi State University. She is presently a board member with the Manitowish Waters Historical Society and researches, writes, and gives tours about the history of Manitowish Waters and northern Wisconsin. We are all looking forward to hear Kay's talk this evening, so I'm pleased to turn this platform over to Kay and welcome you, Kay. The platform is yours.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. And one thing I want to tell you guys is I taught world history, and all my curriculum talked about all these incredible innovations during World War I, like the machine gun and the tank and mustard gas, and never did it talk about wood. But wood is what won that war. That's a pretty broad statement, so let's get started. So James Plunkett is a young man. In 1917, he is 27 years old, and he is an enlisted. People ask him to join. That's the one thing about the 10th Engineers and the 20th. They were all enlisted men. They weren't drafted. And on his grave marker, it says Wisconsin Private First Class 34th Company of the 20th Engineers, World War I. Now, whenever he signed anything, he signed himself off as Private First Class, Company C, the 10th Engineers, even when the 20th had melded into the 10th, or the 10th had melded into the 20th. So anyways, let's get started about James's family a little bit. His parents were James Plunkett and Mary, and they were from French Canada. They were from area around Quebec. And he had 5 siblings, and three only lived. He had two siblings that died in the same week from diphtheria. So I guess that kind of sets us up for this family had quite a struggle. We're really pioneering times. This is a picture of the Plunkett farm. Plunkett's immigrated from Canada to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and I'm sure that they found out about opportunities in northern Wisconsin for loggers to make some cash money in the winter, and some were beginning to promote northern Wisconsin as a farming area, which we all know it failed. But the family came up here, and James's father continued working in the logging industry and ended up in Oregon in 1904 and was killed in a logging accident in Oregon. Here's a picture of the town of Manitowish. And I want you to kind of think about this town as we go through France with James. This is what James knows. This tiny little town in a clear-cut area with a railroad track going through it. And here again is another picture of Manitowish Station, the little train station right in front of us, post office and hotel. From this very small world, James is about to travel thousands and thousands of miles to another forest in southwestern France. Well, the United States enters World War I on April the 4th, 1917, by declaring war on Germany. And you notice that Miss Liberty is sleeping. And what is the message? Wake up, America. So the 10th Engineers are recruited, and who is asked to recruit them? The U.S. Forest Service personnel are recruited, and State Forestry Commission men are recruited, and lumbermen in the lumber field are working on being recruited and their employees. And James was one of the first to be sent to France. Now, everyone had to register for the draft by June the 5th, 1917. Here's an ad. I think it's amazing. These are all the jobs that are open. If you enlist, these are the skills we're looking for. For example, wood filers, top loaders, wagoneers, teamsters, logging teams, saddlers, laborers, trackmen for the railroad, trimmermen for the sawmills, stationary firemen. It goes on and on. So if you'd been working in the woods in northern Wisconsin, you were wanted. And here's a newspaper clipping of James Plunkett and saying that he has enlisted by July 28th, 1917. This is the first postcard. Well, let me tell you a little bit about these postcards. I was sitting in the library in Manitowish Waters, and Mary Burns walked in with a box from her attic, and she said, "This is all Plunkett memorabilia, and we don't know who the pictures are of, and except that it's in the Plunkett family." She put it down on the desk and gave it to the Historical Society. And I went inside the box, and here were a series of postcards that James Plunkett is sending to his sister and his mother while he's over in southwestern France. And another packet of letters was in there, and that was love letters from Emil Wysocki to Rosella, James's sister, while he's working in a lumber camp in Merrill, which is another story that's very interesting. So his first trip, once he's enlisted in Hurley, he's sent to Duluth, and this is the first postcard he sends home. And I got nervous when I looked at that postcard because I said, look at all those white hats. Those look like World War II uniforms. But indeed, in World War I, they were wearing those white caps. Here's a picture of Private First Class James Plunkett. And he looks pretty proud of himself. And again, an image of the 10th Engineers symbol. And I love this. This is by the way, the Forest History Society has wonderful archives on the 10th and 20th Engineers. And I relied heavily on research from that society. And thanks to Mr. Lehman for giving me permission to use a lot of photographs from them. So it's not a regiment, except in its name. It's a great manufacturing establishment. I love that term, manufacturing establishment. Here's an ad for engineers. This is engineers in general, but look, you just apply your skills and we're going to win that war in France. Now, what was the 10th Engineers? So it's considered the first forestry group in the Corps of Engineers. And again, the men that were put into this regiments were foresters and woodsmen. And again, I told you before, U.S. Forest Service, forestry departments in the states, and private lumbermen. 100% volunteer. All units were in place in France by November 1st. So we go to war, April, all the units for doing forestry work are in place by November 1st. Now that means not just sending men over, it means sending portable and permanent sawmills and all the equipment needed. And they were considered an esprit de corps. They were so proud of being lumbermen. So the first mill was operated by the 10th, before the 20th ever came to be. And it was a French mill. And it began operation in a place called Livière d'Eau. And next is the place that James is going to end up, and that is at Ponteau in the Landes Forest. And I'll tell you more about that later. So by the end of the war, October 31st, so they're in place November 1st, by October of 17, by October 31st of 18, they have 81 sawmills operating in France. By November 11th, which is the 11th day of the 11th hour, the troops were producing 2 million feet of lumber and round products per day. And finally, the return of the 10th is in January of 1919. So, as I'm looking around and trying to find out information about James, I come across a newspaper article where he's in the first group of 1,200 men to be sent to Europe. And they're going to be training at the American University grounds in Washington, D.C. But he has two other guys going with him from Thomas Lefebvre from Manitowish and Ray Brugge from Saxon. So kind of cool. Those three guys stay together, but not in the same companies. They're on the boat together, though, and have a good trip over. So again, here's all the things that are needed. And, you know, we take it for granted, but that wood was just precious. Docks, warehouses, casks, firewood, wall supports, tunnels framed in wood, and of course, the ever-needed telephone poles. And then the airplanes were made of wood and canvas. So General Pershing gets involved here in the beginning of the war. You know, he's our commander and of the American Expeditionary Forces. And he said that there is such a problem with getting enough wood that he doesn't want any troops. He wants foresters. Before the troops, he wants foresters. And before Pershing, the British called for 1,000 American foresters and woodsmen to come. And so did the French. And Pershing said, to heck with the British and French. We can't even get started over there unless we get our men. So eventually, all three countries get American soldiers processing wood for the war effort. Now, the country's saying, this is crazy. Why are we sending lumberjacks over to France? We need to be sending people with rifles. No, we needed people with axes. And they also requested that the lumberjacks come from the eastern hardwood lumbering regions because the forests in France were much more similar to those than they were the western forests. So it is probable that most of the men for this first regiment will be drawn from those eastern hardwood forests. Now here is simply a slide with various depictions of the engineers. Now James sends his first postcard after Duluth from St. Louis, Missouri. And he's kind of non-talkative in his letters. He'll just said, oh, I'm in great health. I hope everybody's fine at home on this postcard. But you can tell that he's trying to share what he's getting to see with his mom. And this postcard came to her on July 29th of 17. Where is he sent? He's sent to Jefferson Barracks in LeMay, Missouri. Now, Jefferson Barracks is so famous, it goes way back. It's one of the first training barracks in the United States Army. As a matter of fact, the first cavalry was trained here. It's right on a big river, and there's lots of limestone to build buildings with, and lots of land was given over to this base. And there's James and Tom Lefebvre stick together, and they're at Jefferson Barracks together. The next stop will be Camp American University in Washington, D.C. And here's another letter, but again, it says, that's all it says. I'll write again, first chance. But again, he's sharing his views with his mother. So at Camp American University, they're training, they're doing basic training, but they're not training them as rigorously as they would the combat troops. There's also training for camouflagers here at the same time as the foresters are here. They trained them quickly and they graduated them as soon as they could to send them overseas. And here's a picture courtesy of the American University archives. Again, another letter from the Capitol. We'll send you this card to let you know I'm well, and I hope the same for you. So the 10th Engineers become nicknamed the Lumberjack Regiment, and they're not a fighting force. They're a working force, and they're going to do a great job for this country and the world. And again, why woodsmen? We got to think about how much firewood is needed out in the trenches. Think about the construction that's involved in the trenches. Think about the destroyed railroad ties and natural deterioration of wood in the rotting, muddy waters of the bottoms of the trenches. And here is a timeline that shows you as the boys leave Camp American University on September 9th, they travel immediately to Hoboken, New Jersey, and then they are ferried to the piers in New York of the Cunard line. Now, you know, Cunard was is still a very famous cruise line. So they're a pretty fancy ship. That ship is going to be called the Tuscania. And from New York, they sail to Nova Scotia, and then they have to wait in Nova Scotia for several days, almost a week, I think it is, because they're waiting for escorts to come from Europe to make sure they can get them across the Atlantic safely. So they have to have a convoy. Once the convoy arrives in Halifax, they sail on the Atlantic Ocean. And they sail to Scotland, and they land in Scotland. And James is so excited about the way they are met by the Scottish people. The Scottish people have never seen American soldiers before, and they're so excited and they're so welcoming. They feel like superheroes as they enter. They soon leave Glasgow, Scotland, and enter into Southampton in England. And they go into a rest camp at Southampton, and apparently it's not the nicest place. But you know what's really maddening is while they're in Halifax and while they're in Southampton, the officers get to get off the boat and go have social time in the towns. But the recruited volunteers, so to speak, they got to stay on that ship. And they're getting a little restless. Well, on October 6th, they get on a ship and cross the English Channel. That ship is called La Marguerite. And they arrive in Le Havre, France, then on to Nevers, France, which is central France. And you can see on the maps on the left, you see where Le Havre is right across the English Channel, and Nevers in the center. And then by November 1st, 1917, the 10th Engineers are all in place. Here's a picture of the ship, the Carpathia, from the Cunard lines. Now, that ship was named after the Carpathian Mountains. And it was a very comfortable ship. They had no really serious incidents. James said one of the things that really worried him is he'd spend a lot of time looking for some kind of metal mounds coming out of the water, because the German Unterwasser boats were on patrol, but they were safe this time. Here's another picture of the Carpathia, and it's bringing the boys over to cut wood. Here's the La Marguerite that they traveled on over the English Channel. And here's a photograph from the War Plan Division in 1918 of Nevers. So I just tried to find a little picture of what they might have seen while they were there. This is the storehouse, and on the right is the Signal Corps house. Here's a picture in Nevers of oil and gas barrels ready to be used in the war effort. Well, the newspaper up in Hurley says, wow, everybody got a cablegram. Mr. and Mrs. Lefebvre got a cablegram, and Mrs. Plunkett got a cablegram, and those boys are somewhere in France. And Tom Lefebvre said, remember all the boys to me at home. I miss everyone. Here's another picture of James in his full uniform. So, and here is Pontet-les-Forges in Lens, France. This is the headquarters for the 10th Engineers. I found this in a journal article from the American Forestry Journal on the Forest History Society, and the author of the article was P.S. Ridsdale, how the American Army got its wood. But here's a school complex, and they took it over as headquarters. Now, James writes a really nice letter home to Rosella to talk about the weather. And what I love about this is we're going to meet a very famous woman who comes to talk to the boys. and perform. So first of all, he describes his trip to the Canadian sawmill not too far from where Company C is stationed, and they're going to have a baseball game. And by the way, when the 10th Engineers arrived in France, the Canadians were already there, and they were really helpful in making sure that equipment was arriving for the guys, and if they needed things, they would lend them equipment to get them started. But anyways, they played baseball between the Canadians and the US. And he talked about that day riding through the forest, the miles and miles of forest they traveled through. And then all along the edges of the road, the sycamore trees were hanging overhead into kind of an archway. And they traveled through little towns, and they got to one bigger town and got to have dinner there and enjoy looking at the beautiful French women. Then he tells her that on Monday, after they got back from the baseball game, a woman by the name of Elsie Janis performed for the boys. And he said, boy, was she super. She was a vaudevillian Broadway superstar. And she spent World War I, from the beginning of the war, working with British troops and entertaining them, to when the Americans came in. And her goal was to give the boys a little bit of free time. This is before we had what's that group? The entertainers, like in World War II. She paid her own money to travel around to entertain. And she would sing songs and do impressions of famous people. And some of the songs were Over There, the Joan of Arc. Apparently, if you want to listen to those, they're online on YouTube. But Joan of Arc was one of the most famous songs of the era. And she, even as the war came to winding down, then she spent her time traveling to hospitals and caring and entertaining the troops. So here's Mr. Plunkett from Manitowish being entertained by a Broadway superstar. Unfortunately, her career ends in almost a time where no one remembers her, but she did a great service to the World War I boys. And here's a picture of her. And I have another picture, which I think is great. There she is in her helmet, probably taken from one of her entertaining shows. Now, here's a political cartoon. And what is the weapons that Uncle Sam has? He has the U.S. Forest Service on his hands, and he's got wood to make spruce airplane parts. Then back to the Canadians again. I found a lot of great posters recruiting Canadian foresters. They were very colorful. I didn't find many American posters this colorful, but I wanted to include the Canadians here. And who were the leaders in the 10th and 20th? Well, Colonel James Woodruff organized the 10th. Now, Woodruff is from a long line of military people and he went to West Point, and he was regular Army. Then he had under him Colonel Greeley, who I have some quotes from, who handled, he was the chief of the forestry section. And then a Colonel Mitchell, who was regular engineers, organized the 20th. And in the beginning, the two worked together, and then Mitchell was transferred and Woodruff took over for both the combining of the 10th and the 20th. And then we have Colonel Kelly, who's taking care of all the technical aspects of the engineers, and Johnson, who's in charge of the product and the shipment, and Woolsey, acquisition of timber, and more acquisition of timber. And by the way, you guys, the French were really particular about how their forests were harvested, and they were very sustainable forests, and they weren't about to have them clear cut. Here's a picture of the sawmill and lumberyard at Ponte, where James would have worked. either in the woods or at the sawmill. I've never found exactly what his job was. And again, when they first got over there, the French equipment were really antiquated. The French sawmills were dangerous. As a matter of fact, they said that the French sawmills were perpetrators of profanity. And again, here you see them hauling logs out of the woods with mules. There are trains there, but there's a lot of work that's done by horses and mules. And here's a picture in the lower right of constructing the entryway into and the loading docks at Ponte. And then again, the sawmills. Pretty nice pictures from that war plan division. Here they look like they're doing ties for railroad construction. And here's a picture of a trench in the war, and it's amazing to me. Look at the water running through that trench. Now, the ideal trench would have lumber piled high enough and scaffolding made so that the boys wouldn't be getting trench foot from being in the trench. But again, you see all the different types of wood that are used there. And here's a picture in Belgium of a trench that has been preserved. So if you're ever in Belgium and you want to see this, you can go. But you can, again, see all the wood that's in the construction of trenches. And then on the right, I think it's so interesting how they've interwoven smaller pieces of wood around pilings. So again, if we go over it, we've got to have teamsters and fellers, sawyers and truckers. And we even have to recruit motorcycle guys to come and send messages back and forth to the different sawmills. Now here's a picture of a use of lumber. It's a grenade launcher, and they've got three new, brand new pieces of wood sitting in the trench. These are Scottish soldiers fighting at the front. And again, wagons pulling the logs out of the forest, 1918. Now we've got a log train, narrow gauge railway, and they're moving some pretty big logs there. Now, one of the rules in the French forest is you had to cut the trees at ground level. That was the way you did it, and you didn't leave stumps in the woods. So these Americans here are cutting timber right at the base of the tree. Another picture of guys cutting trees and sitting around kind of taking a break. Now, what about this forest that Plunkett was in? It's in Lands, in Ponto or Ponte. And what it is in the 1700s, the French planted a forest over a heather, or what they called a heather or a moor, a swampy area in southwestern France. Thousands and thousands of acres were planted with pines. As a matter of fact, before those pines were planted and stabilized soil, the villagers raised sheep in these moors and actually used stilts to get around because the wetlands were so soggy. Here we have, again, we've got mules, or I think they're mules, loading and unloading logs that they brought in from the woods. And here's a French sawmill with bandsaw cutting 1-inch boards. And it said that it could cut up to 25,000 a day. Colonel Greeley said that it is doubtful if American soldiers had ever been put to such a test as to have to work in these sawmills. They were dangerous, they were outdated, and as soon as they could get American equipment, they would replace them, but not always did they have that opportunity. And I love this picture because it reminds me of how lumber camps would have mascot animals. And of course, here in France, we've got a little red deer mascot. And here we have a peasant woman coming into one of the 10th or 20th camps to buy firewood. And here's a jammer and loading on trucks. So we've got horses, we've got trucks, we got trains working in the woods. And this is a great picture of a stockpile of firewood and posts and lumber and the decked logs on the railroad right of way. Here's just another picture. Look at the size of that pine log. Amazing. So James is writing back home and the letter gets put in the local newspaper up in Hurley. And again, you notice how he signs his name. Your friend, James Plunkett, Company C, 10th Engineers, and we're already into 1918 when the 20th has been formed. But he says that he's just amazed at the amount of pine trees. But he said, you know, those French foresters will only let us cut the trees that they deem ready to be cut or trees that might be ready to cut in 10 to 15 years, but you just better not cut them all. And he said that the forests were in just beautiful condition, and a lot of these trees were tapped for turpentine. Again, we got our horses in the woods. Now, James writes home and says, you know, it doesn't look much like war here. And, you know, rolling logs can get pretty monotonous. So there's got to be time to have some fun. And, you know, I told you about I'm going to a baseball game with the Canadians and having that famous star, Elsie, come. But also they get some time to go and do a little bit of sightseeing. And again, they're so thankful for packages coming over at Christmas. And you can see what the people in Manitowish were sending, homemade candy and cakes, and they all shared with each other, and sweaters and socks were sent. And James likes the officers. Maybe it's because they're all foresters pretty much, but he says those officers treat us boys tip-top. But please remember us to everybody back home. And by the way, Tom Lefebvre in Company B, who's the cookie, is doing fine. So I just got this little poem off a site by a forest guy, and oops. I surely ain't much of a soldier, or else they'd give me a gun instead of a crosscut for fighting against the dern Hun, and yet I can't help but thinking of what in the devil we do with nothing but crosscuts and axes if ever them botches got through. Now, did any of the engineers die? Yes. Some of the boys were sent to the front with portable sawmills, and some of them were killed in action there. Also on the transporting over on the ocean, when the Carpathian took off out of Halifax, a young man came down with spinal meningitis, and over 50 of the foresters had to be quarantined in England when they arrived. Another terrible thing that happened in 1918 that we all remember is the Spanish flu. And on the way back, several men on the ship with James Plunkett contracted the Spanish flu and died on the way home. And I love this phrase. To cut down the enemy, they didn't use a gun. They used their axes. And this was a cute story. The French were just amazed. In Ponte, some American river drivers took some logs and built themselves a little shanty. And the French said, "Oh my gosh, we could never waste wood like that." So here's your maritime pine arriving at the sawmill and being loaded. Now here's a picture. This is from James's private collection, and he never identified anybody in the photo, but you can see the boys are off duty and they're walking around a fairly large cathedral somewhere in France. Never were they to tell any information in their letters about where they were or what they were doing. And here, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Mont Saint-Michel, but it is absolutely breathtaking. And here's this young 27-year-old from Manitowish, Wisconsin, spending 2 hours of his day touring this beautiful cathedral. And I love this postcard. He sends it to his sister and he says, "How do you like the French laundry?" So here's the women at the side of the river doing the laundry for the week at Chabris. And here's just simply the back of the postcard. Usually wrote 2 or 3 sentences and that was it. But you notice the address, Miss Rosella Plunkett, Manitowish, no need for any streets or anything, Iron County. And then he's just south of where the sawmill was and the pines is the Pyrenees Mountains, and apparently got to spend some time in Châteauray. And one of the most beautiful beaches in the world, Saint-Malo. There's James Plunkett from Manitowish. Having a fine time. Now, this is a front copy of the American Forestry Special Edition that was written in June of 1919. And all of the officers, not all of them, but many of the officers wrote articles. It is just a treasure trove, and that's at the Forest History Society. And here is Lieutenant Colonel Woodruff. Nice looking man, was well beloved by all of the troops. And he wrote a letter to the troops to be given to them as they left for home. And he talks so glowingly about having worked with these men that came out of the forests of Michigan and the forests of Oregon and the forests of New Jersey and Maine and Wisconsin, and how hard they worked. They worked so hard that they produced so much wood that nobody can even believe to this day how much wood was actually, for a mill that was supposed to put out 20,000 board feet, they could put out 50 board feet. They ran the mills 24/7. And they became competitive. They would go back and forth and see who could saw and prepare the wood to the best of their ability and more so. And this is Woodruff's words, they encountered the most trying, exceptional difficulties in getting the production of lumber started in France. And their loyalty, enthusiasm under adverse conditions, and their readiness to perform, it'll never be forgotten. And here is proof that Thomas Lefebvre was in Company B, cook from Manitowish, and James Plunkett, private first class from Manitowish. So that's kind of my story about James Plunkett, and it's about 8:15, but I do have one other small story that I'd like to tell you about a very famous forestry man from Wisconsin who was in the 20th Engineers, and he went over after James was there. But his name was Cornelius Harrington, or Neil Harrington. But first of all, first of all, you got to tell you about what the school children. So a teacher in Ponte had the school children write about these Americans, these lumbermen. And I took two excerpts from what they wrote. And Renee, who was the schoolmaster's daughter, wrote, I like those Americans who came to help France. I like those Americans who came to fight for justice and right. And I admire those Americans who remembered France and came to her in spite of the many dangers. Long live the United States of America. And then another child wrote, now the work of the Americans is certainly a curious one. I saw them harvest logs, lift logs with large pliers as easily as they would have moved a straw. And it struck me especially about those Americans because they were so clean. And all of them were tall, healthy, and strong. And you know what? Their teeth were really white. And you know what? Not to soil their hands, they would even wear gloves when they were working. Okay, so here we go to Cornelius. He's a second lieutenant. He starts out as a sergeant and works his way into second lieutenancy. So he's born in 1891. He goes to the University of Wisconsin in 1903, and he begins work at, no, that's not right, 1903, I'm sorry. But he begins work at Trout Lake while he's in school in 1910 and graduates from forestry at the University of Michigan. And then he's hired as a full-time employee by the Wisconsin Conservation Service in 1913. He helped create the Flambeau, the Kettle Moraine, and the Black River forests. And he became superintendent of parks and forests from 1923 to 1958. Here's a picture of, he has a wonderful collection of artifacts with you guys, I believe, and we have some too in this State Historical Society. But this is the first forestry building ever built in Wisconsin at Trout Lake. And here he is in the straw hat on the right with Ranger McNeil planting seedlings at Trout Lake. And here he is next to a beautiful tree in the Forest Reserve, 1912. And here's a newspaper article saying that these guys, Harrington is in charge of the nursery at Trout Lake for the pine tree planting. And it's one of his first trips to the big city. And here's a picture of Harrington and his ID card for the 20th Engineers. And the reason I'm bringing him up in our talk tonight real quickly is he was involved in the sinking of the Tuscania. He is on this ship going over to Europe, and they're inside of the land of Ireland and Scotland when a U-boat hits the front of the Tuscania. Huge explosion, and the trip and the boat immediately starts listing upwards. And he said they'd been practicing every day, had many issues about they knew where they were supposed to go. They knew where the lifeboats were. He said when we started running to get to the boats, we didn't think we would have any problems, but they had big problems. So as the boat is hit, it first dives upward, then it slants sideways, and the lifeboats are swinging all over the place and dumping men as they're trying to get into the boat, into the ocean. and it's a real mess. Well, he's on a boat on the officer's deck, and there's 20 guys in the boat, and only one end of the boat releases and the other one is dangling, and they all fall into the ocean. And he, as he's falling, grabs a rope on the side of the Tuscania, and he's just hanging there, and a lifeboat is floating under him, and he drops the rope and dumps himself into the boat. He tells this story as if it's just amazing. There's 700 people left on the boat, that all the lifeboats aren't working. They can't use them. And the guys in the water are drowning. And some of the boats, the lifeboats, are being smashed up into the cliffs of Ireland and Scotland area on the shoreline. But Harrington, and he runs into other people from Hurley in the water in the Atlantic Ocean. They get in that lifeboat and they're picked up 4 hours after floating around loose in the sea by a trawler that had been 40 miles from the Tuscania when they got the SOS. So I wanted to tell that story because several Wisconsin boys died in that boat, and it was so terrifying for the families because no one knew who was dead for several days and who had survived. So here's an article in the Escanaba newspaper about worrying about whether young Harrington is alive or not. And here's a picture of the boys that were saved by the trawler and the land in Ireland, and they're in British uniforms because most of the boys were in their skivvies that night when the explosion happened, and so there were no clothes left for them. But here he is marching on the extreme left. And here's where the Tuscania sank, where the red arrow points. And that is the end of my slideshow, and I hope you enjoyed it.
That was really incredible, Kay. Thank you. So much cool information in there. We do have a couple questions in the chat. One was one of the people was wondering what a camouflager was.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure either. I think that they were just being trained to be able to camouflage places so airplanes couldn't see them. So they were probably being trained in how to rig up the material and the areas so that they couldn't see what was down there.
Sure, that makes sense. And then another question we had was, do we know what experience James had working in woods in Wisconsin? Was he a lumberjack? Do we know kind of?
He was a lumberjack.
Okay, excellent. And it looks like another question. Elizabeth said, "Great presentation. Was the Plunkett homestead in the area of Plunkett Road off of Highway 51? Do you happen to know?"
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes. And right across from that, right in that same area, is the Civil Conservation Corps Camp 60, Camp Mercer, Camp 660. There's so much forestry history right there. Pretty cool.
Awesome. If anyone else has any questions for Kay, go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, I will drop this back off to Don and Tom. And thank you so much, Kay. It was such a great presentation.
Thank you very much for letting me talk.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll second what Becky said. It was a great presentation. It was very informative and learned a lot of new things tonight. We all appreciate the fact that you took the time to share this story with us this evening. We thank everyone who joined us for tonight's talk, and we hope that everyone found the story as interesting and that you learned from what Kay had to share with us tonight. Your participation in these webinars is important to the success of our webinar series. And with that in mind, a reminder, when the webinar ends tonight, you'll get a quick 8-question survey to fill out about the presentation. If you could just take a few moments to do that, we'd greatly appreciate it. The Forest History webinars are recorded and available for viewing on our website and our YouTube channel. They're generally posted within another 10, by 10 o'clock tonight. And I see Dan Gustafson just made a comment, just a comment as the chat doesn't seem to be working. I think the Army Reserve unit that used to be at Hurley was the only one in the U.S. to have a sawmill. They would have come to Fort McCoy when I was there in the 1980s.
That's correct.
Okay, and I hope the chat feature was working. We did have a few comments made on the chat, and then just the one on the question. No. And Dan says thank you. So with that, again, thanks, Kay. We very much appreciate you taking the time to spend with us tonight. And thank you all for joining us. We'll be back next month with another webinar on the 3rd Wednesday of March. Have a good night, everyone.